I am Buzz Aldrin, engineer, American astronaut, and the second person to walk on the moon during the Apollo 11 moon landing. Ask me anything. I am hoping to be designated a lunar ambassador along with all the 24 living or deceased crews who have reached the moon. In the meantime, I like to be known as a global space statesman. Mr. Aldrin, do you watch movies about people going to space? If so, which one is your favorite? I have watched many movies, from Martians coming to Earth in New Jersey in the form of giant snakes. This was a radio program created by Orson Welles, War of the Worlds, and I've read many science fiction stories, descriptions by Isaac Asimov, but my favorite of course is Arthur C. Clarke. So 2001: A Space Odyssey, and then later on, I managed to arrange a cruise ship departing from Sri Lanka where Clarke lived, and I was able to stay with him, talking about many things in the past. I wrote a book along with Neil Armstrong and Michael Collins called First on the Moon, and the epilogue was written by Arthur C. Clarke. When I wrote my book of science fiction, Arthur C. Clarke wrote a one-page foreword that was outstanding. Absolutely. As he praised our ingenuity and imagination. And when we visited, we talked about a treasure he had discovered in the ocean, and we both hoped in the future that he and I could scuba dive and perhaps retrieve some of that treasure. That never happened, unfortunately. I thought that movie Gravity, the depiction of people moving around in zero gravity, was really the best I've seen. The free falling, the actions that took place between two people were very, I think, exaggerated, but probably bent the laws of physics. But to a person who's been in space, we would cringe looking at something that we hoped would never happen. It was very thrilling for the person who's never been there because it portrays the hazards, the dangers that could come about if things begin to go wrong. And I think that as I came out of that movie, I said to myself and others, Sandra Bullock deserves an Oscar. Is there any experience on Earth that even compares slightly to having been on the moon? My first words of my impression of being on the surface of the moon that just came to my mind was magnificent desolation. The magnificence of human beings, humanity, planet Earth, maturing the technologies, imagination, and courage to expand our capabilities beyond the next ocean, to dream about being on the moon, and then taking advantage of increases in technology and carrying out that dream, achieving that is magnificent testimony to humanity. But it is also desolate. There is no place on Earth as desolate as what I was viewing in those first few moments on the lunar surface. Because I realized what I was looking at, toward the horizon and in every direction, had not changed in hundreds of thousands of years. Beyond me, I could see the moon curving away. No atmosphere, black sky. Cold. Colder than anyone could experience on Earth when the sun is up, but when the sun is up for 14 days, it gets very hot. No sign of life whatsoever. That is desolate. More desolate than any place on Earth. How did you guys decide who would walk on the moon first? Was it always going to be Neil from the beginning, or was there some rock, paper, scissors matches to decide? I felt that there was obligation on my part to put forth the reasons why a commander who had been burdened down with an enormous amount of responsibility and training for activities, and because of that, in all previous missions, if someone, a crew member, was to spacewalk, it was always the junior person, not the space commander, who would stay inside. We knew this would be different because two people would be going out. There was a group at NASA who felt the junior person, me, should go out first, but many people felt the great symbology of the commander from past expeditions or arrivals at a destination. The decision that was made was absolutely correct as far as who went out first symbolically. However, who was in charge of what happened after both people are outside, I believe, could have been done differently. I was not the commander, I was a junior person, so once both were outside, I followed my leader, because we, NASA, had not put together detailed jobs of people outside. I believe it could have been improved, but it was very successful for what it was, and the decision wasn't up to me, or Neil, it was up to the people much higher up in the NASA. Do the pictures of space do any justice to the real thing? Yes, they do. They recall, for me, the actual experience of myself in space, not by words, not by print, but visual reminders. It brings back a very in-depth appreciation. They can be used very well for communicating in speeches, talks, and more to other people who can actually see what I saw and what the camera saw. Hello, Mr. Aldrin. Is there anything you regret not getting to do while in space? On the Gemini mission in space, on my doctoral thesis at MIT, those techniques were used by Gemini, Apollo, and even the space shuttle. But I was very disappointed when it looked like I wouldn't even have a chance to fly in the two-man Gemini program. I was not scheduled to be anything other than the backup crew. A tragedy changed that, and I was a backup pilot on Gemini 9, and then I would be on the primary crew for Gemini 12, the final mission. The #1 Air Force experiment was on Gemini 9 and 12, but its use was unsuccessful on Gemini 9, and so I became the first astronaut to train underwater in neutral buoyancy. I had been a scuba diver 10 years earlier and knew that training underwater would be very, very effective, and I felt very confident of carrying out the difficult procedures to be able to free maneuver outside the spacecraft with the equipment. This is what George Clooney's character was doing with the jetpack and gravity. Unfortunately, NASA cancelled that experiment. Hi Mr. Aldrin, what advice would you give to a lab full of aspiring engineers and astrophysicists? And what is your favorite flavor of ice cream? Coconut ice cream. Don't waste your time on beaming people up or down. Instead, consider gravity waves as advanced physics of the universe that could be used to travel interstellar distances. And enjoy floating in space rather than being decomposed or recomposed in another location. What's the most frightening moment that you have ever experienced in space? I believe it was after leaving the surface of the moon and completing a successful rendezvous with Mike Collins in the command module. As we approached connecting, docking, the procedures in the checklist said one thing, and I thought maybe doing it a slightly different way, rolling and pitching instead of something else, and I thought that was better on the spur of the moment. It turns out that it was not a good thing to do because it caused the platform to become locked, and we were not able to use the primary thruster, the primary guidance to control the spacecraft to its final few feet to the dock and join the other spacecraft. That was my mistake. I suggested to my commander that we do it differently, and it was his mistake to assume that I knew what I was talking about. So we both made mistakes, brought about by me. We recovered successfully on the abort guidance system. I don't admit that to many people, but I'm sure the mission controllers in Houston, while it was happening, or certainly afterwards, they certainly knew what had happened, but fortunately, they didn't squeal on us. Mr. Aldrin, what do you consider your biggest accomplishment that's totally unrelated to space? I was very close to the top of my class at West Point, and I continue to expand my understanding of the world around me and the human evolutions here on Earth. The achievements perhaps to other people are impressive when I tell them that not only have I been to the North Pole, I haven't been to the South Pole yet, but I have been to the Titanic in a little yellow French submarine. It took an hour and a half just to sink down in the ocean about 2 miles deep to look out the thick glass window and see the Titanic. The visibility was such that we could see the bow. It became very famous in the movie thanks to James Cameron, but the visibility was not so good that you could actually see the bottom of the ocean that the Titanic was resting on. So it was an eerie sight of a ship festooned with rusting metal like gingerbread, floating out the window in the ocean. What advice can you give to a current undergrad aerospace engineering students? Drive over to the nearest airport and enroll in flight classes. You'll experience the joy of freedom in the air above as you study the mechanics of how this is made possible by understanding the construction, the laws of motion, the air that can provide lift when it is moved by propulsion through the air, and stay above the gravity pulling the airplane back down to Earth. Sir, I just wanted to take a moment and say thank you for your push for Mars. You and the crew of 11 have and continue to be an inspiration for all of us. As for a question, what can we, the American public, do to help push the powers that be into legitimate funding for new manned missions to back to the moon or to Mars? Thank you again. We in the United States cannot come close to the return to leadership that the United States had 45 years ago and shortly thereafter. The lack of funding that supported missions to the moon and return, a pioneering effort for humanity, required 4% of the national budget of the United States. Now, we are at half of 1% and have been that way for quite some while. To those of us that feel America is a leader, it was. We helped win World War I, World War II, the Cold War, and we can lead the other nations in peace. Just the way that the plaque on the moon that Neil and I left, we came in peace for all mankind, I believe that that is so American. To do things and share with other nations of the world. That's how we should go back to the moon. Not by competing with other nations like China to land our people. We've done that. The robotics, the operation of rovers and such at a great distance has improved tremendously in the last 45 years. I don't believe the human mind has increased that much at all, so let the other nations of the world put their citizens on the surface of the moon for prestige. That is a major reason why nations put their people on the moon. But we've done that. We can help the other nations, and we can help other nations use our facilities, and then we can deploy a radio telescope on Mars via balloon and design a strong suggestion for what the lunar base should be on the near side and the far side. We can help in the construction of those elements, and we can bring those elements that are landed by other countries because they are heavy and expensive. We can bring them together, and then the interface between elements that will come together in a complicated way because this is in a gravity field with uneven terrain. It's not as simple as the space shuttle docking with the space station or any spacecraft, and zero gravity. It's much more difficult. It requires, from a distance, bringing them sufficiently close and aligning them so that the two interfaces from adjacent cylinders that may be 20 feet in diameter, 30 feet long, vertically part of the shared space on board the base, and from each one of these three can emanate two different nations for a total of 6 different individual nations growing outward for their habitation, and laboratories and to control robots on the surface. To establish a distinct presence and yet sharing with the other people who have their personnel and their astronauts or the front or backside. But that is the great contribution of the United States, technically, but it's not a contribution that requires great investment of money for big rockets and sustaining people on the surface. Returning to the moon with NASA astronauts is not the best usage of our resources because our resources should be directed to outward beyond the moon, to establishing habitation and laboratories on the surface of Mars that can be built, assembled from the close-by moons of Mars with very little time delay, a second or less, much better than controlling things on the moon from the Earth. So when NASA funding comes up for review, please call your lawmakers to support it. Does actual astronaut food taste as bad as the novelty stuff we can randomly buy in stores? I think it has been very selected and prepared for long-duration trips in a partial atmosphere and in zero gravity, or a can of peas or rice or whatever would pretty soon be all over the cabin. In The Simpsons, I played a role where I opened a bag of popcorn and it was all over the place. Bart Simpson said, "No, don't open that." The taste was generally pleasant, but it was mostly freeze-dried, so we had to add water to the container and let it set. And around the instrument panel and other parts of the spacecraft, we had certain places we had Velcro so we could attach things, so we wouldn't have to hold on to each one or have it float around in the cabin. We had to use a water gun to send water into the plastic bag with the freeze-dried food. Now later on, things got much better and they were more like TV dinners that I remember. I don't see too many these days. As long as the food has some stickiness to it, it won't float around. But if it is like M&Ms, they are used in training with zero gravity. They're all over the place, and so would water form into spheres and float around in the cabin. So the crewman has to be very careful about adjusting to a lack of gravity sensation. We had very small shrimp that had a little bit of cocktail sauce and when exposed to water were very tasty. But you wouldn't want a shrimp an inch long floating around the cabin.
Hello, Mr. Aldrin. Our nation and our world have been waiting for another monumental achievement by humanity ever since you were a pioneer in the space race and set foot on the moon. For lack of any serious government effort, I'm rooting for Elon Musk to accomplish this by sending a man to Mars. What advice would you give Elon to achieve the ultimate objective of permanence on Mars? There is very little doubt in my mind that what the next monumental achievement of humanity will be is the first landing by an Earthling, a human being, on the planet Mars. And I expect that within 2 decades of the 50th anniversary of first landing on the moon, that within 2 decades, America will lead an international presence on the planet of Mars. Some people may be rooting for Elon. I think he could, with his SpaceX, contribute considerably, enormously to an international activity, not only at the moon but also on Mars. I have considered whether a landing on Mars could be done by the private sector. It conflicts with my very strong idea, concept, conviction that the first human beings to land on Mars should not come back to Earth. They should be the beginning of a build-up of a colony/settlement. I call it a permanence. A settlement you can visit once or twice, come back, and then decide you want to settle. Same with a colony, but you want it to be permanent from the get-go, from the very first. I know that many people don't feel that that should be done. Some people even consider it distinctly a suicide mission. Not me at all, because we will construct from the moon of Mars, over a period of 6 to 7 years, a landing of different objects at the landing site that will be brought together to form a complete Mars habitat and laboratory. Similar to what has been done at the moon, tourism trips to Mars and back are not the appropriate way for human beings from Earth to have an individual company, no matter how smart, send people to Mars and bring them back. It is very expensive. It delays the obtaining of permanence internationally. Your question referred to a monumental achievement by humanity. That should not be one private company at all. It should be a collection from the very best countries all over the Earth. And the leader of the nation, or the groups who make it a commitment to do that in 2 decades, will be remembered throughout history, hundreds and thousands of years in the future, of the history of humanity, commencing a human occupation of the solar system. Mr. Aldrin, I've always been curious what it would be like to experience re-entry. What kind of emotions did you experience when falling back to Earth? I had 2 re-entries, one in 1966 and one in 1969. In 1966, it was the last re-entry in the 2-person Kennedy program, so I held up a camera against the window to film the flames from the heat shield that was behind us. but foremost in the spacecraft, and the flames were going backwards, away from us in the front. And I was holding the camera and taking photographs. The G-forces increased and I wasn't able to continue to hold the camera against the window, so I had to lay it back against my chest, but I still continued to photograph the re-entry until there was no more unusual visual effects of the energy in the atmosphere. And it was very comforting to understand that the people in Houston, the controllers, had very high confidence that we were on the right path. And the right path means that as long as you enter the atmosphere, the lift of the spacecraft is down to be able to capture the trajectory from the moon. And once that is assured, the spacecraft won't skip out. We now roll the spacecraft so that the lift vector is up. It's predicted by the computer as basically a target, moving it up to where it has to be exactly. And then we could roll the spacecraft so it no longer has increasing lift in any direction, but had zero lift, effectively, and we would guide it down to a point where we could then deploy an automatic device that would slow us down enough that then at 10,000 feet, the 3 parachutes would come out. A little lower, the pressure of the atmosphere outside was greater than inside, and you could smell the salt air, and it was very encouraging to return to Earth. We didn't jettison the parachute soon enough, so the impact on the water moved my fingers away from the circuit breakers, which had to be pushed in before Mike Collins, throwing the switch to jettison the parachutes, could take place. So the parachutes pulled us over and allowed the spacecraft to float upside down rather than side up. Now the engineers were very surprised in the early testing of the spacecraft in water to discover that it would float upside down as well as right side up. So they devised a system of inflating big balloons that would turn the spacecraft right side up. We had to do that. How are the cast and crew of 30 Rock? Anything memorable you can share? Well, 30 Rock means 30 Rockefeller Plaza. My father, in 1925-1926, in the reserve of the Air Corps, worked as aviation fuel manager for the Standard Oil of New Jersey. That's where I lived at the time, and he would go into New York and work at 30 Rockefeller Plaza. So when I was asked to consider participating, I jumped for joy. I can't remember a more pleasant episode of discussions with Tina Fey as we talked about her fictitious mother, I think it was, love affair that she had with me, Buzz Aldrin. And then we looked at the moon, and we both sort of cursed at it for various reasons and said, "I'll never forget the line, 'I walked on your face.'"